Welcome, everybody. This is really a joyous event for us here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I'm David Kramer. I'm the director of the library here at JTS. For those of you who have never been here before, I'll tell you a few words about the library, but I just want to introduce someone. I have a new partner in the work that we do at the library, the leadership of the library, Hava Zellner, whom you probably have not met before. Hava, thank you for joining us. We look forward to, with our entire team, to all kinds of great events like this and others going forward. The JTS Library, many of you know, is one of the most significant connections of rare Judaica anywhere in the world. There is not a topic of Jewish interest that you can do a deep dive into, do serious research without spending some time here. And I'll expand upon the significance of that for this exhibition in a moment. Early on in our history, and for some time after that, we tried to figure out how to express our identity. And one of the titles that we gave ourselves was the Museum of the Jewish Book. I think it was Jewish and not Hebrew. Is that right, Sharon? Do you remember? I think of the Museum of the Jewish Book. Well, that's not what we remained. We became many, many things, but it's fitting that for an institution like ours that thinks of itself as the place, or at least a significant center of record for the history of Jewish books, that we would sponsor with partners an exhibition like the one that is opening tonight. The central piece of this exhibition is not ours, although all the remainder are, and we're very, very proud to have contributed to the exhibition when it first appeared at the Museum of the Bible in DC, and then came up here and is opening tonight. But it's appropriate that if you're exploring a new chapter in the history of the Jewish book, which is what this is very much about, right? If you spend some time not only with the objects, but also with the texts, you'll learn a lot about books in general and about Hebrew books, Jewish books in particular. It's appropriate that we should be partners in an event like this because it is our responsibility to be one of the few places that supports the discovery of new Jewish writings, new Jewish books. New means very, very old, but new to the public. And that's why we're here tonight. I'm particularly pleased with the fact that this exhibition focuses geographically on a very different area of the world than is often our focus here at the seminary library. The truth is, we know this very well, that the Jewish Theological Seminary was founded and then refounded by primarily, not exclusively, by overwhelmingly by Ashkenazic Jews who came to this country in the early part of the 20th century for the refounding of this institution. And it has been stereotyped, not without reason, as a place for the study and flourishing of Ashkenazi Jewry. But we all know, everyone in this room knows, that Jews have lived literally around the world. We have made homes in the West and in the East, in the North and in the South. And given the fact that what remains from our collective cultures, Jewish cultures in our multiple homes, is writings, books, right? It's usually not massive monuments. We didn't build massive monuments, right? And even our smaller monuments, many of them disappeared. But what remained was the monument on paper or on parchment from communities, sure, in Ashkenaz, but from many, many communities in North Africa, in the Near East, in India, and elsewhere across that wonderful map that you see inside. It is our pride and privilege to be able to finally, I think it's exclusive for what we're showing in this exhibition, to focus on that part of the world where Jewish life was so vibrant and remains a central, crucial part of our history and of our reality to this very day. So That's the way we think about it here at the Library of JTS. I want to very quickly run through thanks. Can't mention everybody, but there are a lot of partners who contributed to this. Our community partners include the Afghan Jewish Foundation, the American Sephardi Federation, and here Jason Gurman, where are you, Jason? Just for your hard work and, I mean, many, many Zoom calls. Thank you so much for your partnership. American Sephardi Federation and Congregation Anshe Shalom of Jamaica Estates. Museum of the Bible, right, has been crucial in this from the very, very beginning. There are many of you. Rena told me not to do any names. But Rena, I can't resist just doing a few names. So Dr. Bobby Duke, Chief Curatorial Officer, Herschel Hepler, who you'll hear more from later, Rena, absolutely crucial as project director for this entire endeavor, Amanda Womack, exhibit developer for Museum of the Bible, and Anna Maria Royal, right? The registrar and give me the word again? Registrar is good, okay. So yes, and also conservator, right, for the Museum of the Bible. JTS Library, the co-curator of this exhibition, Sharon Lieberman-Nintz. Thank you, Sharon. Our conservator, Akiko Yamazaki-Claps. Barbara Schur, the designer of what you see inside, and back in the booth over there, Chris Hickey. There's much more I can add, but we don't have the time for that. What we're going to do is we have a program with several presentations. You're going to learn a lot about what is in this exhibition so that when you leave this auditorium and take the food that you want to take that's left out there, you will also be able to go back into the exhibition. It is open, and you will begin with an orientation with a depth of knowledge that will enable you to understand what you're looking at in there far better than you would without what we're about to witness. So we're going to begin now with the first of our speakers, and let me just get the official here. Right, I could do it informally, but we need an official title at least. Professor Ruth Langer of the Department of Theology of Boston College, who is one of the world's experts on Jewish liturgy and has had the opportunity to examine carefully the liturgy of this rare manuscript. And it is with her presentation that we are going to begin on screen.
Greetings to everybody from Boston. I'm sorry not to be with you, and I hear names of various friends who are there in the audience. Sorry not to have the chance to visit with you as well. But it's been a real privilege to have the chance to spend some time thinking about this little manuscript and to be able to talk about it with you tonight. So word of the fascinating little Hebrew liturgical text at the center of our attention today, known to scholars as the Afghan liturgical quire, began to circulate among Jewish liturgists about a dozen years ago. A lucky few, I wasn't among them, were allowed to see and begin to study the text. What I share with you today takes the fruits of their analyses and contextualizes it within the larger picture of the history of Jewish prayer and prayer books. This text, really in some ways more a notebook, represents a transitional stage between orally transmitted rabbinic liturgies and the emergence of fully fledged written prayer books. In this, it represents an otherwise unknown moment of technological change and transition in the life of the Jewish community on the Afghan Silk Road. We ourselves are living in an era of rapid technological change that affects the nature of Jewish prayer. Even traditional Jews are using apps on weekdays instead of printed books. And the Reform movement is embracing visual tefillah, projected and virtually shared prayer texts with rich visual and video enhancements superseding the printed book. Elsewhere, though, synagogues are still largely filled with books, both prayer books and Bibles. The still dominant expectation is that participation in the service happens, book in hand, eyes mostly on that text. And of course, the visual focus of the synagogue is also a book, in archaic form, the scroll of the Torah. But even prayer books once represented a technological revolution. Prayer books were among the first Jewish books printed. Previously, scribes could produce one book at a time, and each was unique. In order to find customers for many copies of the same text, printers had to determine a correct text out of the existing variety, encouraging regional rather than local rights. These books, once they became affordable, also transformed Jewish prayer from a memorized tradition to one that most people read. Hand gestures disappeared, as hands and eyes were now focused on these books. As these printed books circulated widely, it also led to the triumph of these centralized rites, even in the periphery of the Jewish world, including in Afghanistan. In the medieval and early modern worlds, only Jews who could afford to commission or had inherited a prayer book prayed from one. But all, especially men, were expected to pray. So how did this work? Mostly the prayers were memorized, but for the more complex liturgies of holidays, massive, often illuminated prayer books were written for the prayer leader. Many of these books were big enough that others, maybe a quire, read over his shoulder. Various Christian churches still pray in this fashion, not expecting the congregants to make recourse to a prayer book or a missalette. How did these prayer books themselves emerge? This is the crux of our question today. Two technological changes enabled such prayer books to influence others. The arrival of an inexpensive and easily created writing surface, paper, from China along the Silk Road, and the Jewish adoption of the codex. A modern book is technically a codex. This form of writing surface began to develop around the time of the birth of Christianity and was quickly adopted and developed by that new religion. Judaism, in contrast, had long traditions of writing its sacred texts in scroll form, to the point that the form itself became sanctified and ritually required. A scroll is no less a book than a codex, but as all who have ever had to find a place in a Torah scroll know, it is an unwieldy one. The most ancient trove of such Jewish books is known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most date to the centuries around the time of Jesus and include not only biblical texts, but liturgical ones as well. So we've now the context in which to place the Afghan liturgical quire. A quire is like a multi-leaved pamphlet, most often encountered when sewn together today or glued together with other quires into a codex. The Afghan liturgical quire is the earliest preserved datable Hebrew liturgical manuscript in quire or codex form. Not yet what the prayer book would become even a century or so later, but definitely on its way. We have discovered no Jewish texts in Hebrew or Aramaic between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Afghan liturgical quire. Yet we know that Jews were producing lots of literature in these centuries. The bulk of the classical rabbinic library comes from the years 200 to about 700. While they certainly copied written biblical texts for ritual use in this time, this seems to have been primarily an era of orality, with texts transmitted by memorization and the employment of official Tanaim, repeaters, hence the name Torah, oral Torah. Whatever was written down then was secondary to this memorized literature, a memory aid and not the real thing. This was especially true for prayers. Regularly recording these texts in writing apparently begins near the end of the first millennium, as Jews adopted the codex and paper to help transmit these oral traditions reliably over the great distances within and beyond the Arab Empire. Were there books written and read that simply did not survive? Almost certainly. But given the text survived from other cultures, why not the Jews? Something else was going on. A change in terms of liturgical texts happened around the year 875 and led to the first Jewish prayer book. Two different Jewish communities in Spain, the far western edge of the Islamic world, wrote to two rival heads of rabbinic academies in Babylonia, saying effectively, "We know we are supposed to be praying, but how do we do it?" The first rabbinic prayer book was Rav Amram Gaon's lengthy response, containing comprehensive prayer texts and quantities of halachic instructions. This was a text for study, not for praying out of. We don't have Amram's original, but this volume set the model for European prayer books. It continued to be produced into modernity, but usually with the actual prayer texts corrected to those in contemporary use. The Afghan liturgical choir predates the Seder Rav Amram Gaon by a century or more. It comes from a world where prayers were recited by memory and transmitted orally, with perhaps only poetry or new prayers written down for ad hoc use. To understand this dynamic, we need to delve a bit more into the prehistory of the liturgical world of the Afghan liturgical choir. One of the disputes among current scholars of liturgy is the question of how rabbinic prayer emerged. Did someone sit down, as we might today, and compose a written text that was then authoritatively promulgated, as if it were faxed around? This seems overly reliant on modern models of textual transmission. The process was more likely, I think, organic, with circles of pious rabbis compensating for the loss of the Jerusalem temple and coming to agree on some basic structural principles among themselves. These well-educated individuals could be expected to generate their own wordings to fit into an agreed structure. While the basic structures of rabbinic liturgy had emerged by the time of the Mishnah in the early 3rd century, there is very little evidence anywhere in rabbinic literature of fully composed prayer texts. Rabbinic texts occasionally record a specific wording, but usually only where there were disputes about what was appropriate, in most cases, around the margins of the central prayers. As rabbinic style prayers became accepted among a wider populace, particular patterns of specific content and even wordings became more widespread, but were not globally received as officially authorized. The Babylonian rabbis came to understand the snippets of prayer language recorded in their oral Torah to be mandatory, but rabbis in the land of Israel allowed much more flexibility. We know little about the liturgical realities of the rest of the Jewish world in this period. The Afghan liturgical choir thus provides some unique insights into the liturgical reality of the eastern reaches of Persian Jewry in this period of spreading rabbinic influence. It predates by at least a century, maybe two, the composition of the first known written orders of Jewish prayers. It comes from a period when the dynamics of the Jewish world were changing rapidly. The emergence of the Arab Empire enabled expanded trade routes and communications. Prior to this, the rabbis of the land of Israel and of Babylonia were living in warring empires. Some rabbis traveled back and forth, and they knew each other's teachings, but it was limited. There were distinct differences in the two centers' adaptations of the early rabbinic liturgical customs. Jews in the land of Israel developed elaborate traditions of liturgical poetry, piyut, that became the primary focus of individual services, marking every week of the year and every holiday. Their Babylonian counterparts sought to prevent liturgical errors and were much more insistent on precise prayer texts. They became very suspicious of innovations, permitting this poetry only in addition to what they considered the necessary words. In the post-Talmudic period, Babylonian rabbis increasingly formalized parts of the liturgy, sometimes only hinted at in Talmudic traditions. This includes, for instance, the preliminary morning prayers, which took very different forms in the two rabbinic centers. The Afghan liturgical quire comes from this world, but in a complex way. The contents of the quire reflect its location along the Silk Road. This enabled ready cultural exchange with Jews in Persia, Babylonia, and further west, as far as the land of Israel, and liturgical traditions of each appear within our quire. Persia, of course, was geographically the closest, and there are few words in Judeo-Persian instructions included, but there's little to suggest that this quire reflects that rite, about which we know next to nothing in this period. I suspect, instead, that this was a notebook into which local Jews copied prayers carried along with the wares of Jewish traders on the Silk Road, generating not a prayer book, but a miscellany. Indeed, the different parts of this miscellany originate in different parts of the Jewish world. The quire as received reflects the work of several different hands. Someone bound together at least two separate groups of partially filled pages, reversing one grouping so that the blank pages would be contiguous. They then copied additional texts on the remaining blank pages, occasionally incorporating some additional half sheets. Curiously, every single text of this miscellany is also incomplete. We can only wonder why this happened. Perhaps this wasn't their final copy. Perhaps as travelers shared new texts, they used quires like this to make quick copies. Standard prayers received no space in this quire. These would have been memorized, known locally, and orally transmitted. Precious writing materials were not needed for them. However, the contents of the quire demonstrate that these Jews were within the rabbinic orbit. The individual pieces all relate to what later appeared in full prayer books. Most likely, these prayers were new to their collectors. Actually, I missed turning to the list of these prayers for you. Most, if not all, of this quire's contents can be identified as originating close to the period in which the quire has been dated. So as we see here, we have pieces of the Psuke de Zimra in a very early form, a piece of Sukkot poetry, a piece of a Passover Haggadah, and then another piece of Sukkot poetry. So let's begin with the Passover Haggadah, probably originally a discrete group of pages that were then incorporated upside down into the completed quire so that its blank back page, the one on the left, could be of use. This text clearly derives from a standard Babylonian rabbinic celebration of the holiday, but incorporates features to which later rabbinic leaders objected. It begins as expected with Kiddush, the sanctification of the day over a cup of wine, but it breaks off in the middle of the midrash about the four sons, i.e., before even getting to the Passover story. The scribe curiously stopped mid-passage, 2 lines into a new page. The bulk of what does appear here are more unusual versions of standard texts, The manuscript begins with the extended poetic versions of both the blessing over the wine and the Kiddush Hayom, the sanctification of the day following it. Both were known to Babylonian rabbis. Both of these versions were known to Babylonian rabbis in the 10th and 11th centuries, i.e., much after our quire, and they were known to be popular among Persian Jews. It's plausible, though, that these poetic expansions originated in the land of Israel and in its right. We should note also that this manuscript's version of the 4 questions is also unusual, and that this quire simply skips things like dipping a vegetable that likely was part of their ritual. The Haggadah breaks off suddenly, leaving many pages of its original quire blank. Another scribe then flipped the quire upside down, made these blank pages part of an expanded quire, and added a cover page to the whole. Inside that new front cover, he copied what became known as Psuke de Zimra, the verses of song that begin the morning service, here recorded in a version that's almost certainly for the Sabbath. This part of Jewish liturgy is post-Talmudic in its emergence, meaning that it was newly taking shape in the period of our quire. There are elements here coherent with what became the Babylonian rite. The beginning with a hymnic blessing to God as creator, Baruch She'amar, the inclusion of Psalm 92, the day's psalm for the Sabbath, and the prayer from 1 Chronicles 16, Hodul Hashem, praise the eternal, call on God's name, that actually was completed in another hand. It's plausible, but not demonstrable, that the scribe omitted more familiar sections like Psalms 145 to 150 and the concluding blessing, but maybe they aren't part of what he was copying out. Also typical is the inclusion here of centos, new prayers built from complete biblical verses. This is perhaps the origin of the term Psuke de Zimra, verses of song. The Afghan liturgical choir includes the familiar one beginning Yehi Chavod, may the glory of God endure. But this choir includes another enormous, mostly unparalleled cento. Its first section begins with not 2, but 19 verses that start with the word Ashrei, happy is. That instead of introducing Psalm 145 as became normal elsewhere, the cento continues with another almost 60 verses of prayers to God. That's 60. This literary form that juxtaposes complete verses appears occasionally in rabbinite prayers, especially in Psuke de Zimra, but it was most characteristic of the liturgy of the Karaites, Jews who rejected rabbinic leadership and who emerged roughly in the era of our quire. Such compositions begin to appear as new rabbinite prayers in more or less this same time. Indeed, the ability to date and locate this quire provides a new and uniquely concrete data point for this liturgical phenomenon. This dating is also verified by the other 2 sections of our quire. The extensive cycle of liturgical poetry for Sukkot that's squeezed in between these introductory prayers and the Haggadah, and also truncated for lack of space, and another poem for Sukkot, the one that's on the right on your screen, that's added at the end of the manuscript, extending onto its back cover. This poetry most likely originated in the land of Israel, or at least according to its poetic norms. Allusions in the longer poetic cycle, the first one, dates its composition to after the Arab conquest, placing it also in the ballpark of the earliest dating of the quire itself. This also, I think, points to its having been carried by Jewish traders on the Silk Road. And it suggests the phenomenon, known well from later, of prayer leaders avidly collecting poetic versions of the liturgy, seeking to impress their congregants and to enhance their local performance. What we see in this tiny volume, then, is a snapshot of liturgical dynamism. What happens in our day with fancy graphics and visual effects, what in the 17th century Eastern Europe ended up painted on synagogue walls, we see here being produced 1,000 years earlier at the dawn of Jewish codex production. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. We're really grateful for helping to orient us that way. We're now going to hear about the discovery, the modern discovery of the manuscript and how it came to be studied with the person without whose work, labors, this entire thing would never have happened. Herschel Hepler of the Museum of the Bible, Associate Curator of Hebrew Manuscripts.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for taking some time out of your evening to learn about this very exciting discovery in Hebrew manuscript and Hebrew codicology. Now, for as long as I can remember, I've always loved puzzles, chess, and complicated ideas and thoughts. And whenever I started at Museum of the Bible in 2013, this was acquired pretty early on. It was pretty quickly bought and obtained through donation by Museum of the Bible in 2013, 2014, and I was drawn to it very quickly. It's this extremely complicated manuscript with multiple hands and different types of liturgy, morning prayers, liturgical poem for Sukkot, and a Haggadah that's mysteriously upside down, as Dr. Langer greatly summarized for us. This is just a puzzle that I was very drawn to in 2014, 2015, and so I started reading an aspiring Hebrew codicologist and Hebrew paleography. I was really interested to try and figure out why this manuscript was built the way that it's built in this very complicated structure. So pretty quickly learned that Professor Malachi Ben-Aryeh, the former director of the National Library of Israel, he's the father of Hebrew codicology, so I basically read everything I could that he published. And then in 2015, he put together this codicology course in Milan, and I had to go. So in Milan, was able to meet with Malachi, study with him, impressed him a little bit, and then by the end of that conference, he was joking with me and saying, Herschel, I saw where you were coming from, where you work. I wasn't so sure I wanted to bring you to this conference, and but then I decided I'd accept your money. So he, if you knew Professor Malachi Ben-Aryeh, the late great professor, passed a few years ago, he never missed an opportunity to take a wise crack at people he was close to, and I liked him immediately as soon as I met him. And after that conference, I quickly started doing as much paleography research of this manuscript as I could, looking for photos of old Hebrew manuscripts, and then landed on this old black and white photograph of a Hebrew manuscript that I recognized immediately, and it was this manuscript, the manuscript that's in the other room here, the Afghan liturgical quire. And the photographer claimed it was taken in Bamiyan, Afghanistan. So this was mind-blowing to Museum of the Bible and to the curator of the manuscript, me. Just blew us away because all of our information said it was from the Cairo Geniza, the Geniza discovered in the 1890s. And this photographer who took the photograph explained that it was Bamiyan, Afghanistan. So in 1997, Bamiyan was under siege. The Taliban had completely surrounded the Bamiyan Valley, and very little supplies in or out. Every teenage boy or older was essentially a soldier Majority of Bamiyan is a Hazara ethnic minority in Afghanistan, and the Taliban were wiping out Hazara villages across Afghanistan, just massacring entire Hazara villages. And summer 1997, this gentleman finds an old Jewish book in a cave and delivers it to his leader. And it reaches the local leader in Bamiyan, Karim Khalili, who would soon become the second vice president of the country in 2002. So the whole story of this manuscript's origin reads like something out of a Geraldine Brooks novel. Could come out with The People of the Book, Volume 2, on the Afghan liturgical choir if she was interested. But this manuscript, once we discovered that it was from Afghanistan, not from the Cairo Geniza, this presented a number of complications for us for the history of the manuscript, because typically in the museum world and cultural heritage thought, cultural heritage that comes from a country of origin and was not properly exported should be returned to that country of origin. So all else equal, this little liturgical Jewish codex should go back to Afghanistan. So what do you do? So Museum of the Bible, over a period of years, starting in 2018 through 2021, connected with the now former Afghan government, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and presented our findings, and really just explained that we think it would be helpful to connect with the source community, the community of origin, the Afghan Jewish community that is displaced from Afghanistan, and just wonderfully, the Afghan government officials that were involved immediately agreed and said, yes, how do we do this? How do we work together with the displaced community and this museum and come to terms on what to do with this manuscript? So in 2021, while the Taliban were tearing across the country, and with COVID, the now former Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, they were taking time to meet with the Afghan Jewish community and Museum of the Bible. So we're having meetings here in New York. We're eating dinner together at Wolf and Lamb, and talking about working together on this manuscript. And so it's really just this beautiful story of a sacred book bringing us all together, because Museum of the Bible, Afghanistan, and the Afghan Jewish community and Jews all over the world just revere sacred books. As the former professor of Columbia, Salo Barone, once said, books are the lifeblood of the Jewish people. And once we presented all this to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, they completely agreed that we should do this. We should work together, but it was unclear how to work together on this. And so what we ended up doing was building on some of the systems of thought that created Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, Inc. in post-World War II era with Hannah Arendt and Salo Barone here in New York, where hundreds of thousands of Jewish books were redistributed around the world to locations of Jewish spiritual life. We followed the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, human rights-based approach to cultural heritage, prioritizing the community of origin. So working with the source country of Afghanistan to prioritize the community of origin, the now displaced Jewish community. And as a result, the manuscript, the Afghan liturgical choir, stays with Museum of the Bible as its custodian in partnership with the Afghan Jewish community and some of the officials, now former officials, in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So throughout this whole process, something that Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt wrote is, she explained that one of the things that we need to do to combat anti-Semitism is to demystify Judaism. And whenever I found out that this was from Afghanistan, I was terrified because I had a lot of assumptions about Afghanistan. And throughout this process, I learned that most of my assumptions based on war and terrorism were completely misguided. I learned how much the people of Afghanistan are extremely generous and extremely kind. And so through this little book, which if you haven't seen it yet, we'll all see it here in a minute, this little book brought together this really unexpected group of people and institutions to do something really special. And I was just honored to be a part of it. And I hope that you enjoy it whenever you get a chance to look at it, read about it, and spend your time learning more. Thank you.
Wow, what a story. Thanks so much, Herschel, and may we learn from the model of working together with folks with whom we may assume we don't share very much. So thank you for coming. The galleries will be open. You are welcome to go in, enjoy food that might be left. And before you go out, let me just say that we will be soon advertising guided tours of this exhibition. If you'd like to come back, we all know that in some respects, a large opening, particularly for small gallery, is not the best time to spend time with the intimacies of the works that we've got here. So you're invited to come back. And I will just end by saying that I agree with the quotation that was just made, that books are the lifeblood of the Jewish community and the Jewish tradition through the ages. And we, the Library of JTS, who of course are engaged in that lifeblood, we always welcome contributions if you want to support our important work. Enjoy the rest of the evening.